Welcome to the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast with Brian Loughrin.
Hey everyone, welcome back to an all-new episode of the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast with Brian Loughrin. I am your host, Mike Leon. You know, Brian here is a seasoned tax attorney out in Tampa, Florida, the founder of Tampa Tax Relief, and for more than 25 years, he's helped individuals and business owners all across the country resolve serious IRS problems, everything from audits to tax debt to even cases in the U.S. tax court. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about the IRS collection statute expiration date. I don't know what that is, but Brian's going to explain it in a second, and how the IRS determines how long it has to collect a tax debt. You know, Brian, it's good to see you. I don't know anything about this because I'm sure you get this question a lot of like, hey man, how long does the IRS really have to collect this debt? So break it down for folks. When someone does owe the IRS, like how long does the government have to collect, and what does the collection statute expiration date, like what does it represent?
Okay, well, good to see you again, Mike. This CSED, I call it the acronym Collection Statute Expiration Date, and call it the CSED date. The general rule, and this is one that almost everybody seems to know if they've done any kind of online research or had any situation like this in the past, is it's a 10-year window. And so naturally, what people will oftentimes do is they'll say, for instance, on a personal tax return, that's an annual return, they'll look at the year on the return, say it's 2019, and they'll add 10 years and they'll say, well, gosh, the IRS has till 2029 to collect. It's actually the year after because you don't file until the following year. But say you file your 2019 return in April of 2020, that starts a 10-year clock. And that's correct. That's a standard rule. And it's for essentially most all taxes, business and personal. I mean, again, there's some fine line differences, but that's the general rule.
Is there anything else the IRS does to determine when the collection period starts? Like you said, it's always the file date and then add 10. But for particular tax debts, is like, how do they determine when that collection period begins?
Probably the biggest thing we see is where somebody will file a return and then there's an adjustment to it, usually obviously not in their favor, some type of either an audit or maybe some income was left off a return and the IRS comes back. And if they do, it's usually a couple years down the road before the IRS catches something like that. And if they add additional tax to the debt, that additional tax starts its own 10-year window. So you can actually have two, and I've seen cases, three or more different balances on the same tax form, same tax year, but they have different CSED dates, just depending upon when the tax went on or what's really referred to as assessed.
So Brian, let me ask you then, why is it important for taxpayers and the business owners out there to understand that the timeline for the collection's not always as simple as kind of like this single fixed deadline?
Well, because a lot of times people come to us and they have multiple tax periods, not just one. In fact, most of our clients, 90% have multiple tax periods that have issues or debt. And so sometimes people have their mind made up that they're going to kind of tackle the issue when they think one of the years or a couple of the years maybe have dropped off. And they'll come in and they'll say, okay, well, I know what, there's no way I owe on this older year. And I'll say, well, let me check on it because I'm going to get some transcripts and documents directly from the IRS. And I access through the IRS website, through the e-services portal for tax pros. And then I can get those documents and I can ascertain exactly when the CSED date is. And I'll respond back to people and I'll say, well, the good news and bad news. The good news is it's going to drop off. The bad news is there's an additional, say, 3 years beyond what the original date was, or even I can take it down to the month. I don't ever try to do the day exactly, but at least within the month time frame, I can get to the exact date.
Can you describe a situation you've been through where the timing of the IRS collection statute kind of became an important factor, I should say, in resolving that person's case?
Well, somebody will come in with multiple years, and especially one of the first questions I ask people when I talk to them is, what year or years is the IRS saying you have a debt for? And if I hear an older year, something well past 10 years, let's just say, for instance, somebody says 2012, 2013, 15, 18, and so forth. Those are the years that obviously I'm going to drill down very quickly on. And when I report back, either it's dropped off or it hasn't, I'll give them the reason why. But sometimes taking a lot of direct action on a tax matter that you know is scheduled to drop off in a short period of time is going to shape the direction that we're going to go to address the situation, which is kind of a roundabout way of saying if you're on the cusp of having it drop off, sometimes you want to proceed very quietly. You certainly want to stay within the tax code, but you certainly don't have to ring the bell at the IRS door and say, "Hey, you guys only have 6 weeks or 2 months left to collect." I mean, that's their responsibility.
Right, right. Let sleeping dogs lie, right? I think is
Yeah.
the old saying. So, Brian, let me ask you, because you mentioned a second ago about like they could extend the timeline. There's some circumstances or stuff like that. Can I have you explain like what certain actions or events change the timeline that the IRS uses to measure how long it's got to collect? Like, what are some certain things that trigger that?
Well, other than, as I said earlier, the IRS adding additional tax, say due to some type of audit or examination, or just the fact somebody left some income off their return, the biggest thing that happens is that there's certain activities that will freeze or what's called toll, T-O-L-L, the CSED date from running. And an example of that is bankruptcy. Somebody will file for bankruptcy, and assuming that they don't discharge the debt, they come to me and say, well, here's the years that we have balances for and so forth. And of course, I'll say, have you ever filed bankruptcy and something like that? And they'll say, well, yeah. And I'll say, well, that's from the time you filed it till the time the bankruptcy was officially over. That froze that statute of limitation or that CSED date. Another one is offer and compromise. And that's probably the next thing I'm asked about the most is the pennies on the dollar situation that people hear about all the time on TV and on the radio. There again, if you file an offer and compromise from the time that it's submitted until the time there's a final determination, that will also freeze that CSED date. Other things, just basically formal installment agreement request, certain due process hearings, some kind of fine line stuff that most people don't really touch on, but those really are the biggest things where people take steps on their own. And I want to add to that a lot of people come to us after they've engaged these national companies, the 800 number companies I call them, that run all these ads about the pennies on the dollar. And so oftentimes people will engage with those companies, not knowing that the steps that those companies are taking are things such as filing an offer or formal request for installment agreement and so forth. And then they part ways with that company for whatever reason, come to us, and I'll say, well, did you have somebody representing you before? And they'll, yes, we did. And I said, well, were you aware that they did this or that on your behalf? And they'll say no. And I don't expect people to always remember exactly what took place, but there's a lot of times where people come to the door and there have been actions or activities on their tax balances that they're not legitimately aware of. And so, got to inform them of it, but explain why exactly those CSED dates have been extended.
Brian, I want to go back to something you said a second ago about like somebody comes to you and they got several years of tax debt. Going back to that example, when they do come into you, like, how does the collection statute work across those multiple tax periods that they have debt accumulated?
Well, just presuppose that each tax period or tax year is filed at a separate time. Now, the common sense is every April 15th people file, so that 1 year here, then the next year, and so forth. But a lot of times what will happen is when people fall behind on their filings, they will go get the returns completed, and then they'll submit them all literally at the same time. Maybe they'll e-file on the same day if they're the most recent 3 years, or if they're older years, they'll literally mail them in at the same time. So it's not that unusual to see somebody that has 2, 3, 4 years that have the exact same CSED date, even though they're obviously separate years because they're separate tax returns. So that's usually the time where you're going to find them to be consistent. And it doesn't necessarily make it easier or harder. But again, that's an important thing that I like to let people know, because determining the CSED date oftentimes determine the exact actions that we'll take or not take.
Brian, in your experience doing this, what have you seen from a misunderstandings standpoint, or why do misunderstandings about the IRS collection timeline, why does that sometimes lead people to make bad decisions that are going to make the situation worse? What have you seen that?
Yeah, I mean, I've had people call me, and a lot of times people, and it's just kind of human nature, when they're behind on some type of bill, whether it's a tax debt or car payments, mortgage, credit cards, whatever, when they come across some money, and maybe it's, cashing something out, a gift, a bonus, something of sorts, that's when they'll spring into action. So I'm ready to move forward on this. And so I've had many people over the years call and say, hey, I came into some money, cashed something out, inherited some money, whatever. And they'll say, I just went ahead and sent some money to the IRS to kind of make sure that they're okay. And now I want to get with you to, handle some of these other years, because the money I sent in isn't sufficient to satisfy the debt. And I'll say, well, what did you pay on? How did you do it? And so forth. And if you're not careful how you send the money in, the IRS is obviously going to apply those payments to the oldest CSED dates. And that's important to understand because people will say the oldest CSED, the oldest year I owe for is, say, for instance, 2014. But maybe 2014 got filed after you filed 2016. So from a CSED date standpoint, what they call the oldest tax period is really the 2016 because you filed that and it got processed before you filed 2014. So they'll inadvertently pay to the wrong year or just send money to the IRS. And of course, the IRS, common sense, they're going to apply that payment unless it's designated specifically otherwise to the oldest CSED date, because that way they preserve their ability to collect. And I've had people inform me that they've paid, in some cases, a tremendous amount of money on balances that were destined to fall off or maybe would have even fallen off before they called me. So you just be careful if you want to kind of make a lump sum payment. There's some strategy involved.
Well, Brian, you just fed into the follow-up because you just said it. But for someone who's listening to this and they're still on the fence about why they should reach out to a tax attorney, can you explain to them what role you play in helping them and evaluating how the collection timeline applies to their case?
Well, I always said these IRS transcripts and documents, they're in government language or government English, I call it, where it's mind-numbingly dull. It's black and white. The same kind of font. It's just like looking at one of those puzzles that swirl around in your head. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And without going into any kind of detail on that, I've read literally thousands or probably tens of thousands of IRS transcripts. So I can determine pretty quickly what the CSED dates are. There are times where it's not 100% clear to me and I have to do additional digging or even contact the IRS very quietly because I've seen mistakes made on these CSED dates. One example that I see quite often is somebody will file a return, and let's just use round numbers. They think they owe $10,000, and they'll submit the return, and it has a balance of $10,000. And then the IRS will come in maybe 2, even 3 years later and say, oh no, you actually owe an additional $40,000. Okay. And so going forward, the IRS computer is saying the total, which is $50,000, the CSED date on that is the second assessment. And, call the IRS and they'll say, no, that first portion should have dropped off or will drop off shortly. And so you kind of go around and around like that. So, I'll be able to determine very quickly what those CSED dates are. And again, it plays a role in the strategy and how you're wanting to pay on these debts. It also plays a big role if you are in a situation where you have CSED dates that are running 4, 5, 6 years from now before any of them expire. That also can play a role. So I just tell people, let me take a look at it. Let me size up the situation. Then I'm going to advise what I think is in your best interest.
Yeah. It's great advice as always. Brian, can't thank you enough for the time and the insights. Appreciate it as always, my friend.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
That's it for today's episode of the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast. If you want to learn more, you want to connect with Brian, you've got tax debt, you don't know any of this, do me a favor right now. Visit tampataxrelief.com to schedule that consultation or connect with Brian and the team. And one more favor, as always, hit like, hit subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.